So, um, get these notes to me over here. Yep. Okay. So last time, reminders, Muddy's point, as usual, concept check. First concept check for unit 3, do this Sunday. Next concept check a week later. Mini project for 2, which a bunch have already turned in, up through immunocomputing, do this Sunday. Mini project for this unit, do a week later. So last time we started with multi-objective optimization and Pareto efficiency and Pareto optimality. So as a quick reminder, the idea there is if you had, for example, you have a two objectives, maybe one that you want to maximize, the other that you want to minimize. If you want to draw that, um, well, I'll do 2 max just because that's like we did last time, because it's maybe a little easier. I'm just trying to think if there's a good way. Well, yeah, so I mean, I guess I'll just draw it this way because I want to show that it's not all, 2 maximization problems. If you happen to have an optimization objective F1 that you would like to maximize, and you might have another optimization objective, maybe I'll draw it the other way here. Well, that'll be fine. And you might have another optimization objective, F2, that you might want to say minimize. If I maybe draw my optimization objective F1 goes like this, then the ideal spot to be on at F1 is up here, but it may be that the minimum of F2 doesn't agree. So if I then for F2 had some optimization objective that say looked like, I don't know, looked like this, then in that case, you might want to be here on F2, but if we were to connect those two, well, they're awful darn close. Let me move that over. But the idea is if we were to connect those two, then there might be a disagreement. So if I were to make this um, maybe a little bit more over here, then the idea here is that this minimum and this maximum do not line up. And so you would expect intuitively that you're probably going to investigate this space in between them. And what we said that we formalize this idea by saying, where are there so-called Pareto improvements? And Pareto improvements are position or movements, changes in your decision variable that improve both optimization objectives simultaneously. So in the case of this lower one, it's good to move down. In the case of this upper one, it's good to move up. And so if you position yourself anywhere to the left of this line, then if you were to move to the right, you're going to move up in one and you're going to move down in the other. So we say that this region is full of Pareto improvements. And so likewise, this region over here, if you're to position yourself at any of these points, at this point, if you move to the left, then you're going to get in the good direction, and to the left also is in the good direction in this one. So you have Pareto improvements on both sides here. So this is the kind of Pareto improvement direction in this direction, and this is the Pareto improvement direction in this direction. And so those are the regions that you would like to avoid suggesting solutions for. So these are kind of objectively bad regions. So this is poor choices, and these here are poor choices. And then so this region in between, and I guess I'll color not green, but maybe blue. Then that region is this trade-off region where it's unclear what, there's no obvious movement that if you start at any point in that region, it's not clear that things are better off if you go to the left, you go to the right. In particular, for any point in that region, if you make a movement that it improves one objective, it will create a reduction in quality of the other objective, or of at least one other objective. And so there are no Pareto improvements that can be made. So we call it a Pareto efficient set. So that was the term we had there. So this here is our Pareto efficient set. And so this is going to be the output of our optimization procedure. So rather than suggesting a single solution to the multi-objective problem, we provide a set of solutions that characterize trade-offs among the two objectives. So really what Pareto optimality is about is getting rid of the solutions that people can objectively say were bad solutions, and then provide a set of solutions that can be investigated for further discussion, so that then maybe additional subjectivity can be added to choose which one of those. But this ends up being often a more useful optimization construct, because even when somebody comes up with one optimization objective, if you really push them, you find out that other things matter to them. And once other things matter to them, then it becomes multi-objective. Once it becomes multi-objective, then it's more interesting to characterize the trade-off between objectives than the best point in a particular objective. And so that's the idea behind Pareto efficiency. So this is sort of hard to draw, especially once you get more than two objectives. So we usually plot it not in the kind of decision space, but instead in the objective space. So I'll try to do that for this one. So here I'm trying to say I've got F2 that I want to minimize and F1 that I want to maximize. So if I were to draw that out next to this, then I've got my F1 here where X isn't shown anywhere, my F2 here. And remember, in the F1 direction, was not expecting that. Sorry about that. Okay, in the F1 direction, we would like to maximize. So this is our max. So this is the good direction. And in our F2 direction, we would like to minimize. So in here, this is the good direction. And so here, if I to look at across all values of X, so if I choose a value of X here I've got a positive value of F1, but not that positive, and a very positive value of F2. Whereas down here, I have a very low value of F2 corresponding to a low value of F1. So for each one of these X's, I could plot points in a space here that represents all of the pairs of these two together. So, so if I do that, say, if I try to do that for starting from this axis here, I've got an F2 that is whatever that value is, we're going to call that in an F1 of 0. So F1 of 0, F2, so that's maybe somewhere up here. And then so if I then keep moving over, then my F2 is going to go down, but my F1 is going to go up. So the F2 is going to go down, the F1 is going to go up. So maybe I'm over here. And so I can keep doing that so that eventually I get to the point where F1 is maximized and F2 is still getting smaller. So eventually somewhere over here, I've got some points that are over here somewhere. Now, at that particular point, then F1 is going to get smaller, while F2 also gets smaller. So now so I'm going to want to draw, so these points as they show up, they'll keep going down, but now F1 will go down as well. So I've got F1, maybe those come over this way. And so eventually I get to a point where where at this point here, where F2 starts getting larger again, but F1 just keeps getting smaller. So F2 starts getting larger again, but F1 keeps getting smaller. Maybe that starts going up this direction. So it ends up tracing out this shape. And because I only have the one dimension in my decision space, then it just traces out this line here. But if this was multivariate, so if I had an x1 and x2, this is a vector here, then this might fill out that whole space. So you could start getting larger sort of shapes here. But the point is, these are all of the feasible combinations of I'll say these are feasible combos of objectives. And so when we look at this in objective space, then we sort of need to say, well, which one of these are we where are we happiest with this space? And if I look at the directions here, and this is where it can get tricky, so you have to sort of remember which direction is good and so on. So here I see that the good direction is going down in F2 and going up in F1. So that means that the Pareto improvement direction for this simple problem is going to be in that direction. So if you can manage to move both down and to the right, you're making a Pareto improvement. So where on this graph is the Pareto frontier? So from which of these points is it impossible to make a Pareto improvement? Any guesses? Yeah. You mean these right here? Or these right here? Or these ones here? Yeah, well, so let's see, let's say I was at this point right here. Is it possible to make a Pareto improvement from this point? Yeah, so this one right here. That's my Pareto frontier. So I'll highlight that, and then we'll make sure everybody feels confident with that. So this right here is my Pareto front, or sometimes called frontier. Um, this is the sort of Pareto optimal set of solutions here. So there are no Pareto improvements possible from these points. So if I start at any one of these points, then it is not possible for me to improve things in both directions. I can move from here to here, and if I move things from here to here, that is good for F1, but it's bad for F2. So moving along the frontier means that you are going to trade off among your optimization objectives. And there is no way to move within that frontier in a way that improves it for everything. But these points here, I just keep moving this way. Here, I just keep moving this way. And because Pareto improvements are possible, that is not Pareto efficient up here, but it is Pareto efficient down here because there's no movements that are possible. So that is the Pareto frontier. It goes kind of against the good directions here. So if your good directions are moving in this direction, you're looking for the set of points that are sort of at the edge of that movement. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? So when we talk about the Pareto efficient set, we're talking about the decision space variables that correspond to that frontier. But we're talking about the Pareto frontier, we're talking about this structure here when we're plotted in objective space. And so we've got these two dimensions here, so this forms a line. So we go from 2 dimensions to 1. If you had 3 objectives, then there would be a plane, and so on and so forth. And so your frontier becomes a submanifold in this space, which corresponds to that. Yep. Not for this solution concept. So for general Pareto frontier, the amount of improvement or the amount of losses is not weighted at all. I mentioned at the last class that there is another set. So this is sort of, advanced, but I'll say extra reading on something called Calder-Hicks equilibria and the so-called potential Pareto improvement. And this is not something that we worry about too much here, although I might have a question or something that'll bring this up, but it'll motivate the idea. But um, but the sort of question you're asking was motivated people to come up with this, where in this case, they said that it's only that you have additional Pareto improvements. So we would normally say the Pareto improvement is something that improves things for everybody. But in a lot of real problems, or once you get lots and lots and lots of objectives, it's impossible to find any Pareto improvements. And so the Calder-Hicks idea was that, well, if there is some way to trade between these units, these criteria, this currency and this currency, then we can somehow weight the improvement in one and the losses in the other. And if the improvement in one is greater than the losses in another, we call that a potential Pareto improvement. And that would mean, from a social perspective, that if you're the one that is tied to this income stream and someone else is the one tied to this income stream, then you could theoretically, behind the scenes, whoever benefits from the change in position could pay the person who loses. That doesn't mean they have to, that doesn't mean they will, but that's where the term potential Pareto improvement comes in. But as far as we're concerned, we work with sort of a smaller set and we don't assume such side transactions are possible. But it's still a problem that if you have like 100 objectives, if you're looking for the Pareto frontier might be the entire decision space. And so that's not very useful. So then you have to come back to the stakeholder and say, well, there's just too many things you're asking me to weight. You're like, it would be completely arbitrary for me to come up with a weighting among all these things. So that isn't something I could go through. Can you relax this a little bit so that we can maybe analyze the trade-off between objectives 1, 2, and 3? And once you see the trade-offs between 1, 2, and 3, you might actually find that the costs you pay in 3 are really light relative to the benefits you get in 1 and 2. So we can drop 3. And then it becomes like a model selection problem where it's like, well, okay, now that or feature selection problem, if you like, now that I've sort of dropped 3, maybe I can bring in 4 and do the same exercise. And then you eventually find almost like you're making these awful analogies, like a PCA, where you'd say, well, even though I started out with 100 objectives, really there are only 5 objectives that are really salient, that really have strong trade-offs with each other. And once I've found those 5 objectives, then I do my optimization problem on them. All right, other questions about this framework? All right, so I mentioned the selection of objectives, and I just want to throw in to connect to the stuff we've already talked about. Before we go on to figuring out how we're going to actually solve for these things and complex problems, I want to mention one of the formulations that is useful here is the so-called AFPO, or age fitness Pareto optimization. And this is particularly popular in evolutionary robotics. And AFPO, you come into it and you say, I have one objective for my robot to do, but I don't have an objective function, so I'm going to use a simulation or a real robot in my genetic algorithm, so that's evolutionary robotics, to try to improve that objective. So I want to collect as many objects there are in the room, or maybe, so this is actually one, there's a guy named Josh Bongard and some of his colleagues have created these soft robots that plug in together, kind of like Legos, and they oscillate. And you don't necessarily control the oscillations, but you can control the sort of shape and size of each one of these little Lego blocks and where they are in this mass. And so you want to put these things together to get cohesive movement of this block, even though the little blocks are just jiggling. If you set them down on a surface, they don't move. But if you get them to jiggle in a certain way that you can get these kind of waves that are formed, then theoretically you can get this thing to move, kind of like a snake or a slug or something like that. So they used an evolutionary algorithm and they had a simulator of each one of these blocks. And then they put in the sim, they just tried like, all right, now let's try 100 blocks, 100 blocks, and then all of the different combinations we can of those 100 blocks. And for each combination, let's see if it slithers across the simulated floor. And this process worked for them, and they eventually actually then were able to take that design and then implement it in the lab with real blocks that did this, and it certainly did slide across the floor. Now, they found that using a standard genetic algorithm did not solve, it was not giving them good solutions very quickly. It was sort of coming up to these kind of local optima. It wasn't maintaining the diversity in their population that gave them a nice result. So they used this age fitness Pareto optimization. I think Todd Lipson was also one of the first ones to kind of get into this. He's kind of in that group. And so the idea here is that you set F1 to be your normal fitness function. And so this is, for example, like, speed moving across floor. And I'd say maybe average speed. So the idea is like if you let it go for 10 minutes, you see how far it moves in 10 minutes. That's basically average speed. Then they said fitness function 2, let's just make it the age of the genotype. And let's think about what that does. So now you've got a genotype, which is basically, and the genotype here is basically a design for the soft robot aggregation. And so what for any age, this is going, and an ideal here, you want to maximize this fitness function. And let's say we also want to maximize age. All right, so what does this do to your population? Well, for any age, it is going to prefer genotypes of that age that do better in terms of speed. So it still puts a lot of pressure on speed, but it keeps in the population older genotypes that relative to genotypes of that age, they still do pretty well. But they just may not do as well as some of the younger genotypes. So if you're a younger genotype, if you're a new genotype, you're kept in the population if you're really, really good. But if you're an older genotype, then you're sort of allowed to have kind of a lower fitness. But for genotypes of that age, you will be the higher fitness. So what this does is it helps to maintain genetic diversity in the evolutionary robotics process, which helps with evolvability. So what they found is that it was much easier to find functional and much easier, much quicker to find functional designs doing this because some of these older but maybe less fit solutions, as they mutated in novel ways and as they recombined with some of these younger solutions, then they were better at producing these massive increases in performance. And so a lot of these older genotypes might have had like, they might have been 3 or 4 mutations away from getting it right. By keeping them in but getting it really a lot better. By keeping them in the population, it sort of allowed for those 3 or 4 mutations to kind of accumulate. So it allowed a little bit more flexibility here, as opposed to them just being washed out once another local optima. Like it might be that a younger genotype came up and it happened to do a lot better than an older genotype, but it did it in a very different way. And maybe the younger genotype was the greedy solution. So you can find that the younger genotypes that are doing better might pursue some greedy solution that is a dead end, whereas the older genotype can kind of accumulate mutations over time until actually finding the overall better solution that required several generations to search for. So that's kind of the idea here, is that using this a Pareto optimality, using Pareto solvers to maintain diversity for a single objective problem. And this is kind of a microcosm of what we're going to see over the next unit or two, is that in order for us to build multi-objective evolutionary algorithms that solve the Pareto optimality problem, maintaining diversity is going to be a huge part of it. People in building multi-objective genetic algorithms learned a lot about generating diversity in genetic algorithms in general. Once they had that, it allowed them to build other things like more diverse single objective algorithms and single objective algorithms that do more useful things. If you remember in your the mini project 1, probably in all of your population eventually converge to the top of a single peak. Well, that's fine, but wouldn't it have been better if you had a member at the top of the highest peak, and then some of the rest of those that were just kind of trending up at the top were spread out around all the other peaks? Like, it just would be more useful information to know where all the peaks are. You could still take the highest one, but at least then you kind of got a better idea of where some of the other local optima were. That's so-called multimodal optimization. And the kind of niche preservation or the diversity preservation that was kind of discovered by solving multi-objective problems then allowed for reintroducing those ideas into single objective problems to do things like saying, well, I'm not only going to find the best point for you, but I'm going to find a bunch of other really good alternatives in case you don't like that best point. So I mentioned last time that single objective optimization you learn in high school, setting the derivative equals 0 and solving, kind of stops discussion. And it might stop discussion with a crappy answer. Multi-objective optimization starts discussion. It sort of eliminates all the things you shouldn't be talking about, so you only talk about the things that are most important. What we've learned in building multi-objective optimizers helps us then rebuild single objective optimizers that actually start discussion. So you could say, I know you said you have this one objective. Of this one objective, there actually are multiple different ways to do very well at that one objective. This is the best one, but you only actually suffer a little bit if you go to this one. And then if you start talking to your stakeholder about that, they're like, oh, this one requires me to use a bunch of these parts. This is actually a really costly thing to implement. This one over here that takes a little bit of a cut is much cheaper for me to implement. It turns out that that's actually more important to me. What they're communicating to you is, I actually had 2 objectives in mind. I just forgot to tell you cost was one of my objectives. But now that you've shown me a bunch of these really good things in terms of performance, I can then add in my cost evaluations later. So that's why diversity ends up being much more of a very useful property, and why you'll see that people try to use ideas from multi-objective optimization to inject diversity to make the design process better. All right, so that's AFPO. It's kind of just a motivational story where we're going. Now I want to get into actually how to build these things to find these Pareto frontiers. But any questions about that? Okay. All right, so I'm doing this without notes. I should make sure I'm not forgetting things. But as I'm standing here, I'll mention that um, the first couple of methods that we'll talk about are based on the ideas that I think some of you came up with as well, just thinking about it for a second, sitting there in your chairs, about weight-based options. So start here. So we mentioned that maybe one way to solve this optimality problem is to weight all of your objectives with convex combinations. So I got some W. So if there's two objectives, you'd have W and a 1 minus W, W times F1 plus 1 minus W times F2, and then just sweep through the whole range of W's, solving each one of those single objective problems and then getting that. And so that's these approaches that we're going to start with are based on that idea as well. So these are weighted sum approaches. And this is the first attempt at multi-objective GA, first attempts. And these were okay, but I'll list kind of complications with each one of them. But the major problem here is the inability to deal with non-convex Pareto frontiers. And what do I mean by that? So if you were to plot F1, and let's say I want to minimize F1, and F2, where again I would like to minimize, if the true Pareto frontier looks like this, like that. So you've got a bunch of points out here, and then this down here is our true Pareto frontier. Now, if you tried to solve this by saying, let's just say my attempt is to minimize WF1, the minimize over X, WF1 of X plus 1 minus W F2. Now, if you think about that, if you do the kind of standard high school optimization here with maybe a little bit of multivariate calculus sprinkled in for flavor, then what you're you're gonna take the derivative of this thing with respect to X. You're gonna set that partial equal to 0 for a W that you set. So let's say you do this for all of these different W's. And so what you're going to end up getting is something along the lines of that at the equilibrium for each W, you'll get something like the partial F2 over partial X over partial F1 over partial X is equal to, and I might get these reversed. I should, since I'm not working it out. So if my numerator and denominator are flipped, then I apologize for that, but you get the basic idea here that I think it'll end up being, W and then actually W minus 1. So in this, I could actually simplify this to say then, so it's basically the partial of F2 over the partial of F1 is equal to W over W minus 1. This is basically the, solution will look like this. So geometrically, what that means is that for the particular W you pick, what you're picking is a slope in this space. And so, if you might pick a particular W that has this slope that is tangent at that point. And that is effectively this down here. That's what we're kind of talking about there, is that for a particular W. So if I were to draw, this, say this W down here, something like this, maybe I'll move that so it's tangent right there. So then we have for some W, this is a solution. And it is on the Pareto frontier. And so if you sweep the W's around, you're going to change the slope of this thing, and you're going to sweep out up to this part of the frontier and down through, well, that's going to be the problem, down through some amount of this frontier. The problem here is that if you think about it, there's another point of tangency for this line over here. And so if I were to take a copy of this, and this is a bit of an oversimplification, but I hope it makes the point at least geometrically. So if I take that exact same point, or exact same slope, then that means that, actually, that point also meets those conditions. But if you use a traditional solver, a single objective solver, then it's going to think that is the minimum that you want, not that one. So as a consequence of this, weight-based Pareto optimal approaches end up only finding the convex hull of the Pareto frontier. So you end up finding basically this thing, and maybe you might get lucky and get this point out here, but you end up not finding any of this here. These end up being hidden to weighted sum approaches. And so this over here, weighted sum approaches find convex hull of the Pareto frontier. So if your Pareto frontier is convex, that's fine, but you can come up with optimization objectives. Like you could say it happens to be that F1 is a cosine, and so it's got multiple peaks and valleys. And F2 is maybe another sinusoid at a different frequency. And if you do that, then what you're going to find is that those two things together create inflection points like this one. And if you then use a weighted sum approach, you'll get your whole population is piled up here, and then you get nothing over here, even though that's where the true Pareto frontier is. So this is the downside of using weighted sum approaches. And this is why our modern approaches use something called Pareto ranking that we're going to introduce probably next time, which if you use a tool like just the other day, my office mate was telling our grad student to use an SGA2. And NSGA2 is a very popular multi-objective problem for two objectives. NSGA3 is for three or more, and it uses this so-called Pareto ranking approach. If you go into MATLAB, there's a GA multi-obj that is just provided with MATLAB. It uses Pareto ranking. So Pareto ranking is the modern way to do it, which is a wildly different way to solve this problem than weighted sum approaches. And the reason when they sought it out is because weighted sum approaches have this problem. So questions about that? So we're going to talk about some weighted sum approaches because they're good historically to know and because they feel very intuitive before we then move up to Pareto ranking, which is a totally different way to do it. And I would argue Pareto ranking is a more evolutionarily consistent way to do it as well. Okay, great. Okay, so the preliminaries, the things to keep in mind. So we've been talking about kind of evolutionary methods. So this multi-objective is kind of like, evolution, sort of population genetics meets community ecology. And so when we're designing these tools, are going to try um, to to do things that have nice analogies to these two fields. And so if I draw a Pareto frontier, so I'm just going to draw an F1 and F2. So this is my F1, this is my F2. I guess I'll say we're going to maximize just to make the visualization a little bit better. And so if I were to imagine a Pareto frontier that was through here, so let's say this is our Pareto frontier. And so we've got a bunch of possible solutions back here. Then what we want our algorithms to do is to bring us as close to the frontier as possible, but then also as spread out along the frontier as possible. So we're trying to kind of move in this direction. So we're trying to get, one, move toward frontier, and then two, maintain and expand diversity along frontier. And so this relates to community ecology because we don't ever say there's like an optimal organism. There's no optimal body form. We can't say that an ant is better than a bee, or that an amoeba is better than a bacterium. That we there all of these things just have different strategies. We can say that there are certain strategies within a species that are going to cause those strategies to be more represented in the next generation. So there is an optimal pressure within species, but across species, it's sort of silly to say that one's better than another. Like, no, they just trade off differently. So really, when we think about fitness, fitness is your kind of how close you are to this frontier, how close you are to the trade-off space. So that's really, if we were to sort of draw these ISO curves here, we could say that like, this is fitness. Maybe I'll try to write that in a different color and maybe a different thickness here. So this here is fitness. It's sort of your distance away from the origin. And but then, so effectively, we can kind of view the Pareto frontier, each one of these solutions, as being in some ways equally fit, but using different strategies. And so this creates a community of coexistence. So how do you get two different species existing in the same habitat? They exploit different niches. If they're in the same niche, then they end up outcompeting whoever's most efficient at using that niche ends up being the one that dominates. They end up eating all the food, the other one perishes. So how do you survive? How do you coexist in a community? You find a different niche. Your niche might be crawling on the ground as an ant. Your niche might be flying in the air as a bird. But ultimately, you're trying to all reproduce faster. But the way the ant does it is not even, you can't even compete with the way the bird does it. And so they sort of form these different niches. And so we kind of view these regions across this Pareto frontier as a sort of, as kind of these niches. So fitness is distance to the frontier. The frontier itself is a community of coexisting solutions, and the niches are the spots along the frontier. So if speed is really important to you and that's your F2, then the speed niche would be this one in this top corner. If cost is most or that is something that we want to maximize, if comfort is your F1 and that's really important to you, then you can have the comfort niche. So how do you get sports cars and luxury vehicles existing in the same in the same population? Well, they just exploit different niches. Some people like comfort, other people like speedy cars. So they can coexist because they don't actually have to compete with each other because there's a niche separation. And that's what's going on behind the scenes in our multi-objective algorithms, is we're trying to find ways to make them better in all things. That's fitness. And then once we've sort of hit a point where it's impossible to improve in one objective without taking away from another objective, then we try to maintain diversity. So if we already have one here, we try to keep it here. But then if we generate a mutation, we would like to mutate one that is far enough away that it's going to be in a different niche where it can coexist. That's kind of the conceptual model. So this is sort of the community ecology, and that's kind of the population genetics. All right, so that's sort of some of the terms. So you're going to see terms like niching, diversity, niche separation, stuff like that. And I've already kind of mentioned some of these things, but as before, we've got our X bar. This is kind of our chromosome, where X1, X2, um, uh, up through XN, those are our genes. And then, of course, there's each gene has different alleles. This is all from before. What's newish is that we have, and then, and then all the alleles together in an individual are our genotype, which is just another name for our candidate strategy. Okay, so what is something I've been talking about, but hopefully is becoming more clear, is that we view objective one, so we'll call that F of one, or F1 of X, that we're calling a character, and its value is a trait. And then objective two, F2, is also another character, where again the value is a trait. And then so if you do that for all of your objectives, and then the combination of trait values is our phenotype. So we are not assigning fitness to one objective. We are assigning fitness to multiple objectives. And so if we map it to the picture that I just drew there, then what we're saying is that one phenotype is more fit than another if it does better in all of its traits. So if it's good to be fast and it's good to be maneuverable, let's say as a prey, if it's good to be fast and good to be maneuverable, then you're going to do better if you're both faster and more maneuverable than the other prey, because you will get away from the predators. At some point, though, your physiology will hit a physical limit where it will be impossible to become faster without becoming less maneuverable, or impossible to become more maneuverable without becoming slower. And so that is what at that point, you can then choose, am I going to be fast or am I going to be maneuverable? Though if you're really fast but not very maneuverable, that there is a niche for you. If you're really maneuverable but not very fast, there is a niche for you. And so at that point, we don't say that they differ in fitness. They differ in strategy. They differ in how they choose to do their trade-offs. So so just emphasizing from before, fitness is a function of phenotype, and where more fit is a Pareto improvement. And so once you have multiple objectives, just like once you can't sort numbers once they're tuples, right? Like you can sort the real numbers, but you can't sort the complex numbers. You can sort them by magnitude, but magnitude is effectively a fitness concept because you're aggregating them together because multiple numbers have the same magnitude. It's the same idea here. Multiple strategies will have the same fitness. It's our goal to find all the strategies that are high fitness and maximize our diversity of our samples. That's the thing here. So, it's not everything will be rankable by fitness. They're going to get equivalence classes of fitness in these algorithms. Questions about any of the terminology? Okay, great. All right, so let's see how some of these basic ones are done. So the kind of first example is, and I might gloss over some details here just so we can spend most of our time, probably next time, on Pareto ranking. But sort of the kind of an old example is WBGAMO, which you might guess is weight-based GA for multi-objective. And this is a traditional GA, but borrowing a little bit from evolutionary strategies, what they do is they assign weights to every objective, and then they then add those weights to the chromosome so that the genotype of every individual includes different weights. So it's like I am going to have a set of weights, which and that is what's going to be used to evaluate my fitness. You are going to have a set of weights, and that'll be used to evaluate your fitness. And so we compete using different fitness calculations. And that's how this thing works. So we have assign convex weights. So they add to 1, W2, all the way up to whatever WK, to each objective, or in this case, I had K objectives, and then add these to chromosome. So each genotype has different weights. And then each individual fitness is calculated with their own weights. And that will try to optimize trade-offs simultaneously, but it has to increase the chromosome size. So everybody's got a bigger chromosome, so you have a more memory. And but then you just use a standard traditional GA. So they really didn't change the GA at all. You can implement this in MATLAB's GA just where your the function that you plug into MATLAB when you say calculate fitness will end up taking the W's in, and it will scale the true fitness objectives that are embedded inside there to output a fitness to MATLAB. MATLAB will have no idea that it's doing a multi-objective optimization problem. As far as it knows, it's doing a single objective optimization problem, but every individual's fitness is determined by a different weighted combination of the objectives that actually matter. So that's WBGAMO. And so, it has the same problems we mentioned before. It doesn't find concave segments of Pareto frontiers. But any questions about this? I was hoping this is the most straightforward, where we just take the standard GA, we plop on weights to the chromosomes so that every individual can differ in their weights. And then that theoretically will give us a diverse spread, because some individuals will be more weighted for F1, other individuals will be more weighted for F2, and then hopefully we maintain them. And of course, the problem, when I say problems, is larger chromosomes and only convex Pareto frontiers. Okay, so if you want to optimize that a little bit, okay, good. So another option to that is to take the weights out of the chromosome and randomize them every time you calculate fitness. So that's the so-called random weight GA. And so here, weights are randomized at each fitness evaluation. They are not a part of chromosome. So the idea here is, it's very similar to a standard GA. So you have like a random population in step one. In step two, you assign fitness by drawing random weights that sum to one. And this is one per objective. And so, you could do that just by drawing K weights and then normalizing them. That'd be one way to do that. So you draw K weights, you add them all up together, see what their sum is, divide each one of the K weights by that sum, and now you've got a random set of weights which sum to one. So from there, then you calculate fitness. And so everybody on this round is going to use the same weights. So you calculate fitness for all using these weights. So in the next round, they'll use different weights. So then you can do, proportional selection. Now that you've got the fitness, mutation and crossover, elites, remove populations, and so on and so forth, and check stopping conditions. So then the rest is basically conventional GA with elites, which will involve eventually coming back over and iterating here after checking for termination. And by the way, checking for termination in multi-objective is a little more complicated, because you have to kind of come up with a more clever way to to say like, well, now that I don't have just a single fitness objective, then how do I maybe check to see if all the fitness objectives haven't moved much and so on. But that's kind of a, there are ways to do it. But then you come back up and then you redo that. So the first round, you're going to be more biased towards speed. The second round, you'll be more biased towards maneuverability. The third round, so on and so forth, might be an equal weight. And so the idea here is that hopefully this will, if there are improvements that can be made in all of the objectives, it's not going to matter how they're weighted. Those things are going to be selected. So you will march toward the Pareto frontier. But once you're on the Pareto frontier, then hopefully in some rounds you pull it up the frontier, and other rounds you pull it down the frontier. That hopefully this approach creates diverse solutions. But it's really just a kind of an optimization of the previous approach, where still has the problem of only finding convex Pareto frontiers. All right, questions about that? All right, and I just want to show you one more of these historical ones to give you another idea of a way. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, though they initially start at a random population here, which will be in the Pareto frontier. They'll kind of, this is F1 and F2, and say we're trying to maximize. So this is the frontier. Then they all kind of start at random points down here. And then this population, the ones that can manage to make Pareto improvements, regardless of what the weightings are going to be, are probably going to be better. So then that will generally cause this population to move up. It doesn't say anything what's going to happen to their diversity. But so eventually then you get a population that lands somewhere, possibly in multiple pieces along the frontier. And then this population will hopefully get spread out along the frontier so that you get a good sample along the frontier, as long as it's convex. Does that make sense? Any other questions? So the other way that you can do this is, instead of using weights, you can do kind of shuffled objectives. So, and that's what the last one I'll cover here before we just transition to Pareto ranking next time. So that's sort of what you get the feel of here by choosing random weights. It's sort of saying, I want different blends of these objectives. Well, maybe it's simpler to just say, I'm going to run a GA, but some rounds of the GA, I'm going to run one objective. Other rounds of the GA, I'm going to run another objective. Maybe I create subpopulations where some populations do one objective, another population does another objective, and then I mix between them. And that is effectively what Vega does. So vector enabled GA, or sorry, vector evaluated GA. And so the idea here is that I have n individuals, but I want ns subpopulations of size k. So my ns is equal to n over k. Not sorry, I should say ns size. So what I mean by that, let me switch that. K populations of size ns, sorry. K subpopulations of size ns. So this is subpopulation size. So the idea here is I have a random initial condition. I check my termination conditions, and then I'm going to divide everybody up into these K groups. And then for each one of these groups, I'm going to assign them fitness based on each of the K optimization objectives. So yeah, I've got times. I'll just write this out. So we got random initial population. Then we do check termination condition, whatever that is. Then we randomly sort in individuals into the K subpopulations. And we're going to call this migration. So it's a little like everybody after they did well in their previous populations and they bred, then their offspring go off and they reassort. And they reassort in new populations where offspring that were strong in one objective meet offspring that were strong in another objective so they can cross over and create new types of interesting offspring. So that's why we're randomly resorting into these populations. And then we can say for each objective K, in our, 1 to K, we've got our K populations. So we're going to assign fitness in population K using objective K. Objective K. And then we'll do our selection. So select NS solutions using this fitness. And then we can, and then before we do crossover mutation, we combine. So combine subpopulations into N-sized population, and then do crossover and mutation. And then iterate. And then iterate. Which goes back to 2. So you could imagine slightly different ways to do this, but basic idea is rather than subjecting everyone to every objective in different mixtures, you subtract some to each objective, and then have them figure out which ones do really well with respect to each objective, and then those become the specialists on that particular objective. These are the speed specialists, these are the maneuverability specialists, and so on. And then you let them recombine together, literally come back together and mate, so that you get a speed specialist that mates with a maneuverability specialist, and hopefully produces an offspring that is good at something in between, and so on and so forth. Now this has 2 problems. So it for one, this actually has the same problem, that it only finds the convex hull, but it has another problem, that it tends to be bad at creating mixtures. I'll say creating mixed strategies. And I think if you look at it, it kind of makes sense that you end up getting a bunch of clumps at the edge of the frontiers near the pure strategies. And so you do get diversity. So it's like you solve, multiple GAs, but you just don't quite get in between. So that's kind of a downside here, but it is at least another approach. So question? Well, so this select NS sort of already withered things down to just the best. Well, the trouble is here we have no notion of what an elite is, because we don't have a central notion of fitness. So that's why they don't actually have a set of elites here, because they didn't. If you combine thing into a fitness, like the first example that we did here, this weight based, we tricked the GA. And likewise, you can kind of do it here too, because you do calculate a single fitness function. You can then sort of say, well, who are my elites in this weighted fitness function? But here, there's no like elites. And so in this kind of simple version of this, then this is sort of the strongest selection pressure you get. And then so you can, I think very easily the problem is that you lose because there's just no way to really reward those that have mixtures of strategies. You just lose them because the selection pressure for the pure strategies are just too high. Yeah. Right. It'll be kind of very clumped, very discrete. So you get an F1 set and an F2 set, like, or an objective one and objective two set. So, but the point is, these are kind of like the first ideas of how to get multi-objective working. Modern multi-objective uses Pareto ranking, which is what we will introduce next time. And it is much, much better at this stuff. All right, that's all I got for you. So we'll see you next week.